So when I was in seminary, I took a class about the immigrant experience in Atlanta. As part of that, we were encouraged to go worship at a church that was not using English. And so I went to one of the larger Korean Presbyterian churches in the city. I think within 2 minutes of finding a place in the sanctuary, this usher came up to me with an English language bulletin because I might have been the only person out of 1,000 in that sanctuary who didn't have black hair. I stood out. Didn't know a word of Korean, and it was fascinating because even though I was in this crowd of, there might have been 1,000 people in there, I felt very isolated, and I felt alone because I was in a different setting. And maybe you felt that way. You felt alone. You felt isolated, even though you're surrounded by people. I recently started watching, there's a show on Amazon Prime called Clarkson's Farm. And Jeremy Clarkson, formerly of Top Gear, he buys a farm in 2019. And in season one, he's running this farm shop in the early days of COVID. And it's a reminder of how isolated we all were. We stayed home, we went out, and when you went out, you were desperate to try not to get too close to anyone. And so he's selling potatoes, and there's a bucket in the middle of the parking lot. And so people would come up, they'd leave their money in the bucket, and then walk off with the potatoes, and nobody would get close to each other. And then he said they would take the money and put it in the freezer for 2 weeks to kill any potential germs. And it feels like a million years ago. It's amazing to think it was only 5 years ago that we were all doing this. We were all so concerned. Everything was so unknown. But the most important thing was that we self-isolated. And it was such a strange time. I remember meeting Anne Markham at the cemetery for the burial service that we did for her husband. And she came up to me and gave me this big hug. And I didn't know what to do. It was the most human thing to do at the time. But given what we were all going through, it felt strange. It felt foreign because we'd all been so used to being isolated. And that moment when she came up and embraced me, it was a reminder of this is what we need. We need community at times like this. And so today's reading from Mark 5, it tackles all of this, the brokenness of humanity, how sin tries to destroy what God has created, how human community fractures due to sin, what Jesus is actively doing about it, and then what he charges us with. There's a ton in here. We're not going to be able to get to all of it in detail, but my hope is that by the time we're done, you'll have an understanding for the relentless pursuit that Jesus has for you, and that the power and the desire that Jesus has to restore you to life and to the community. Whenever we talk about restoration in the Gospels, we remember, like the cross, there's a vertical and a horizontal component to it. We're restored to God and we're restored to the community. Christianity, it's about the community. It's not just me and God, but it's about how I'm interacting with and serving the people around me. Excuse me. Sorry. I haven't done that before, I think, on camera. So the Gospels, they're teaching us about ourselves. They're primarily teaching us about God. And so do you remember what we talked about last week? Boat rides with Jesus. So I don't know if it's never get in a boat with Jesus, or if you get in a boat, you definitely want Jesus with you. So the answer is one of the two. I'm not sure which. So Jesus had been teaching the crowd. He decided to travel by boat at night to the other side of the lake, and there was a storm in the middle of the night. Disciples are terrified. Jesus stands up. He calms the storm. They eventually make it through to the other side of the lake. And we pick up the story here in Mark 5:1. And so Jesus has been through a lot to get here. And upon his arrival, there is no chauffeur waiting in baggage claim to make his arrival easy and seamless. We're told that he is immediately met by a man with an unclean spirit. The man, we're told, has been often bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched them apart. And the people in the village, they got to a point where they could no longer chain him, and so they banish him to live in the tombs. You can tell it's progressively getting worse. He's progressively getting more isolated. They can witness him crying out and cutting himself with stones. The demon that has possessed him is trying to destroy him. He pulled away from the community. He's attacking him relentlessly. It's what sin does. It attacks our bodies. It attacks our relationships. We are made in the image of God, and the devil is trying to destroy that. Addiction impacts us. Any addiction, anything you're addicted to, it impacts our bodies, it impacts our spirits, it impacts our lives, it impacts our relationships. Disease does this. It impacts our bodies and our minds. It isolates us often. Most of us can't identify with a man cutting himself after having been banished from the neighborhood, but we can identify with someone who is in anguish as their body fails them, who isn't at peace with anyone in their community. This man has been given up on by people in his community. They tried to maintain a relationship, but it was too hard, and so they sent him to the tombs. They said, away with him. It makes me think about our political parties. It makes me wonder, are they still trying to maintain community? I'll admit I chose to watch a hockey game rather than Trump's address to Congress the other night, but I saw some of the clips afterwards, and I couldn't help but just be struck by the gulf between the two parties. Have we given up on communication, on trying to maintain that relationship? Have we banished the other party to the tombs? I've read each side's justification for their position as to the other party, and I understand all of the arguments where people are coming from. I think, like the people in the village, each side claims they've done what they can to maintain the relationship. But have things gone too far? And if so, what comes next? I don't have an answer for this, but I notice the division in our society, and I notice the call of Jesus, again, and we're getting back to restore community, to maintain community, to think about those vertical and horizontal relationships, and how do we truly, like Jesus, wish the best for everyone. So this man, so he's in the tombs. We learn later there are pig farmers nearby. And so two things, right, these both give us a clue as to how off limits this would be to a Jew. Death is incredibly impure. Pigs are banned. So if you're living among death and pigs, you could not be farther from the heart of Jewish life. And so guess where Jesus comes first? He's been sailing all night, so there's plenty of options. But the first place he goes is a place filled with death, surrounded by pigs, and inhabited by a man who cannot be bound by shackles and chains and spends his days cutting himself with stones. And you might think you're too far gone for Jesus. Isn't it amazing? Jesus goes to the place farthest off limits for any self-respecting Jew. He makes a beeline there because he knows that there is a man suffering there, a man losing his battle against sin, who's completely alone in the world. And to this man, filled with despair, watching the world spin out of control, Jesus comes. So don't you ever, for one moment, let yourself believe that your life is too messy for Jesus. Jesus has never seen a life too messy to be involved. Such is the love of God that he will go directly to it. There's plenty of people who need his help. Whenever he stopped to preach, thousands of people would show up. When he was home, so many people came to listen to him that if you needed healing, you needed to cut a hole in the roof to get his attention. And yet this man thinks nothing of crossing a lake at night in a storm to reach one hurting soul. During our Ash Wednesday service, we sang, Jesus loves me. Truer words do not exist in the English language. Jesus crossed the lake for this man, and he will do the same for you. He walks into a place of death and shows that life can triumph there. This is the Easter story, preparing us for what is to come, when Jesus enters the tomb to demonstrate his power over death. And the final piece of the story, it's a reminder to us. The people in the village where this man had been, they were scared of Jesus' power, and so they beg him to leave. And he agrees to go, which means that he crossed the lake in the storm for this one task, for this one man. This formerly demon-possessed man, he wants to go with Jesus. Instead, Jesus tells him to go home to his friends and tell the story of God's mercy. And I read this and I stop at that word, friends. Where have his friends been? This man has been chained up multiple times. He's been kicked out of town to go live in the cemetery. With friends like that, who needs enemies? Where are his friends? Where have they been? And yet we're told this man did just as Jesus said. He told his story. He's found his friends. They'd abandoned him. And yet through his healing, he found friends. What was in the past was clearly forgiven. There's restoration. Jesus wants the same for us. Our faith is not meant to be lived in isolation. Our story is not just for us. You've been through things in your life, hard things, suffering. Some of them you're probably not sure how you made them through, except for the grace of God. Some of you are in those things right now, wondering how you'll make it through. You feel an enemy tearing at you, isolated, breaking you down. And there's a God who runs to you through the storm. Jesus wasn't about to let this man be lost, and he isn't about to let you be lost. There's a world of people out there like this man, not in the same condition, but each is under attack in some way, big or small. Each might feel isolated, even if they're in the midst of a large crowd of people. Loneliness looks different on each of us. To every one of these people, Jesus would cross a lake in the middle of a storm. Jesus walks into a place of death to demonstrate there is still hope, there is still life. How do we maintain community? How do we share our stories? How do we tell of the times when Jesus showed us life in the midst of death, community in the midst of isolation? When you go out this week, in the sunshine that is coming, in the warmth that is finally coming, and you're going through your neighborhood, pray for each house, for the people that you pass. Pray for God to make a way to tell the gospel story, to tell your story, to tighten the bonds that hold us as a community, that we might hold tightly to hope, that we might be inspired by the one who comes through the storm to share life with us in the midst of death. Thanks be to God.